Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a Q&A episode, and I have actually going to go over 4 questions today, just because I feel like none of these are going to take a ton of time, so I'll give you a bonus question for the day. But first, before I do that, just want to go over a few ways you can help support the podcast. First, if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find this podcast. Again, I want to continue to get this out to more people, and one of the best ways to do that is other people see that people listen to it. And again, I appreciate everybody who listens to this podcast. So again, if this has been helpful in any way, if you could, if you are new, obviously give yourself, a couple episodes to listen and then go from there. Next, if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Jeff, HOEHN_. Again, that's where I'm most active on social media. If you have any questions on this podcast or anything like that, that'd be the place to reach out to me. And again, I'm always a DM away there. So make sure you give me a follow there. With that out of the way, let's dive into today's question. My first question is what to do if forearms are the limiting factor on lat pull downs. I'm going to go over 2 things here. I'm going to go over what to do, and then I'm also going to go over why this is potentially an issue. Let's start with why it's potentially an issue. When we're trying to build muscle, we want the target muscle to be the limiting factor, right? And if something like your forearm ends up being the thing that causes you to stop that set, we're probably leaving a little bit more in the tank in terms of our back, and we're probably leaving a little bit of results on the table there. And so again, if you're somebody who you're just like, man, I really don't feel like my back is in a good spot, again, that could be one thing to look at. And probably part of it is your grip ends up being the limiting factor there. And again, not necessarily your back muscles, which is a problem, right? And this is also where some confusion can come into play with like reps and reserve training. Is it's like, oh, I was done, I went to failure, but the target muscle may not have been the limiting factor there, right? So that's why it's a problem. Again, it's not that you're not going to see any muscle growth stay in your back, but again, we could probably be more efficient and get more gains for the work that we're putting in, right? And that's ultimately what I feel like most people want to do. They want, you probably want to, you want to get as much results as you can in the time that you're spending there versus going in and like doing things, but you're not necessarily maximizing your results, right? So again, I would imagine that's what you would want here in this situation. So that's why it's a problem. Next, so it's like, what do we do? Okay, so first, one thing that's been super helpful for me is using something like VersaGrips. I love these VersaGrips. They're just straps, right? And they can help ensure that your back ends up being the limiting factor, right? And these can be helpful for Romanian deadlifts, anything where there's a grip component to it, which is a lot of things. Now, if you're doing chest presses and stuff like that, pressing type movements, you probably don't need it. Bicep curls, you're not going to need it. But again, things that require you to hold on to the weight, and whether that just be isometrically, like in a Romanian deadlift, or again in the back, you're obviously actively moving throughout the range of motion there, moving your hands and everything, and moving the weights. These can still be super helpful. Lunges is another great one as well too. Step ups, things like that. So we want to get some sort of grips, and what that will do is now that will make sure that your back is more likely going to be the limiting factor versus your grip. Now you can push a little bit further, closer to failure with your back training there. So again, that would be the first thing. Next, I think a little tip specifically for lat pull downs would be, think about your hands as hooks. Okay, so your hands are literally just hooks. They're just holding on to the weight, and then the main focus, you're initiating that movement and driving through with your elbows. Okay. So your elbows are going to be the thing that you ultimately move. I just see too many people just try to use maybe too much of their arms in pulling movements. And again, part of that is just from the intent of not driving with your elbows, right? So again, your hands are hooks and you're pulling through with your elbows there, right? So again, that would be the next thing that we would want to do there. That's how we would work through that. Lastly, on back, to just understand back is another interesting one where it's a double whammy. You have the grip aspect of it, but then you also have the fact that the most back movements are hardest in the shortened position, which we've talked about, shortened versus lengthen. And the shortened position, it has its role in muscle growth in terms of the range of motion, right? But if that ends up being a limiting factor, it's like we probably have a little bit more to give in, say, the lengthened position. And so this is where not only using grips can help to make sure that your back is a limiting factor, but also utilizing things like partials. And again, just making sure that you don't necessarily need to stop your set because you can't go all the way down with the movement, right? So that's where the back is shortened, is at the bottom of the lat pull down, but that's also where it's the hardest as well too. So again, you could see where if we're skipping out on that top part of the range of motion and stopping because we can't get all the way down, we're probably leaving a little bit in the tank. So we have a double whammy there with the grip and then this as well too. So if you can do those 2 things in your back training, I think it will really help develop your back musculature. All right, I had another question come around good fat sources. And what I want to do is I also want to go on a little rant about fat. So you're going to get 2 answers here in one. So good go-to fat sources. So we have what I would call like more, I hate to say health versus not health, because again, we know calories at the end of the day, like this good food versus bad food. Again, we want to have a good base of, again, more nutrient dense foods. Calories are, to me, are more than just like healthy versus unhealthy. It's, hey, what's the enjoyment aspect of it? How does it fit into your entire diet versus thinking like good or bad foods? However, I do think when it comes to fats, people probably spend a little bit too much time on saturated fats, right? I do think that we can improve our food quality here. And I think fats are definitely a big one that people can certainly improve, right? So I want to go over some good go-to fat sources there. And these are fat sources that you're probably not consuming enough of. I actually had a call with a client yesterday. I'm like, oh, she's eating around 100 grams of fat. I'm like, where do most of your fats come from? And she said, they come from like desserts, right? So it's okay. So again, if we're just looking at a macro standpoint, we could talk what's better, high fat, low fat, higher, moderate fat, whatever it may be. But again, that quality of that food is going to be super important. And so this is where we need to look into that a little bit more and where we can improve things. And again, where macro tracking can go awry here by just focusing on that. So what I want to do is, again, saturated fats, like getting a little bit of that in is fine. I don't want to be like, oh, hey, you can't have any saturated fats. But if that's going to make up most of your fat intake, we probably have some room for improvement in terms of just overall health, and probably just also improving your metabolic health as well too, right? Making sure that that's in a good spot. Because again, that's where if we just focus on fats and not necessarily the quality of fats, we can run into some potential issues there. Like I mentioned, saturated fats aren't necessarily bad, right? Like I said, they can be used within a balanced diet. However, we do want to be careful with too much coming from saturated fats, right? We also want to make sure we get some unsaturated fats, which I will talk about here. But what are some sources of saturated fats? We're looking at like our fattier meats, some chicken and turkey, like the skin, obviously, again, so we're talking fattier sides here of like proteins and stuff like that. But for meats, like I said, high fat cuts of beef, pork, lamb, processed meats like sausages, hot dogs, and bacon, these are all going to be higher sources of saturated fat. Dairy products, so whole milk, cream, cheese, butter, all these other dairy products are all going to be saturated fats. And then obviously processed and packaged foods, baked goods, pastries, cakes, cookies, donuts. These are all going to be saturated fats. Snacks, crackers, chips, microwave popcorn. These are all going to be things that are going to have saturated fats. Fried foods, again, saturated fats. It's not that we can't have any of these things, but we want to make sure we balance it out. That's my first kind of thought here on fats. And so what would be some good go-to fat sources and fat sources that I think more people could add in? That's going to be whole eggs. I think whole eggs are great. You know, people talk about cholesterol, but we know that like just because it has cholesterol in it doesn't mean that's necessarily going to raise your cholesterol, right? That's more going to be a lifestyle overall diet pattern versus like, oh, hey, eggs have cholesterol in them. Hey, we can't have them. Again, whole eggs, they're going to have, it's going to have nutrients in it that are helpful, choline being one of them, but they also pack protein as well too. And so again, eating whole eggs. Now, if you're somebody who's fat loss dieting, maybe you have, if you really like eggs, maybe you're not getting all your eggs from whole eggs. Maybe you're getting some just egg whites in there, but you aren't necessarily just skipping out on the egg yolks. And again, you're getting whole eggs in there. What I will say for me personally, eggs do too much. Egg will cause some stomach issues for me. Again, I think that's person to person, but that is something I've noticed. Salmon, right? Really any fatty fish, but I've looked this up. Really outside of salmon, I'm like, man, any other fatty fish is nasty. But salmon would be a great one, right? Nuts, those are going to be great as well too to add in. Olive oil is going to be great. Avocado. So these are all sources of fats that we want to add in. And I think too many people, in seeds as well too, right? Too many people don't like when they do fats, that's usually from saturated fat is what's the majority of it. And I've been there before, right? And I think fats also get scared away because, oh, they're more calorie dense, so we want to be careful with them. But again, if we can get more of our fats from these sources, you're going to be in a great spot there. And this kind of leads me to my rant on fats. Speaking of fats, I think people who are macro focused, if you're somebody who's really just tracked macros for a while, I think what happens there is people end up missing out on fats or they don't get enough, right? This ends up being the macro that people overlook. And I think this comes down to when we're doing our macros, I feel like from a body composition standpoint, it's always been, hey, lower fats, higher carb, higher protein. And then also like from a satiety standpoint, people like fats are a little bit more calorie dense. I want to try to get in as much food volume as possible. And I think people end up missing out on fats because of that. And like I said, then the fats that they do get in, it's mostly from saturated fats, right? And so we want to be careful with this like I think a lot of people can improve their food volume, but then you also can take it too far and focus too much on food volume. And it's like, now you're missing out on these sources of fats. And I say this because I've been there myself. I remember I don't track my calories and macros religiously anymore. I'm more focused on watching where my weight's trending and then also like making sure I'm hitting my base of, hey, I'm getting some of these fats in. Hey, I'm getting carbohydrates in. I'm getting plenty of protein in, right? That's more so what I'm focused on now at this point, and just making sure I'm eating enough, but also not too much either. And But I've been there before in previous fat loss phases. I would track, and then fats would always be the hardest one for me to get to. And again, that just came from this, hey, you're in a fat loss phase, you need to be overly focused on food volume, eat all these carbs, etc. And I think that's just a big mistake. I'm not saying you need to go keto, but don't be afraid of some fats, especially from the sources I mentioned before. So that's just my rant on fats. I think they can be super beneficial. I think too many people are too low on them, and their sources of fats are poor in general. And with that, obviously we need a certain amount of protein each day, especially when we're more body comp focused. We want a little bit more protein. But fats are another one that they're essential, and we need to get them through our diet. Whereas carbs are a little bit more, we have a little bit more wiggle room there, and those can vary based on activity levels, obviously your current calorie amount as well too there. But fats are definitely one we don't want to be too low on. What's that number? I think a minimum to hit is 30 to 40 grams a day. Again, mostly from these sources that I talked about here, with a little bit from saturated fat. Somebody did ask me, they're like, hey, what about for a 100-pound female, or they're under 100 pounds? What would you recommend? I still said, hey, I wouldn't go much lower than under 30 for fats there, right? Again, we want to make sure we are getting in fats, and that gives you a good number. And then from there, once you hit that minimum, then you just have to figure out how many calories you have, make sure you get enough protein at this minimum fat, and then really the rest you can divvy up between fats and carbohydrate based on what you want there. And again, making sure that we're also not going super low carbohydrate either. Now, there obviously would be some situations where that could work, but in most situations, for you, the listener here, we don't want carbs to also get too low. So it's striking that balance there. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that made you rethink your fats and what to do there with those. All right, so I just switched up from reverse / slight surplus to a cut. 5 days in, and I'm up 5.5 pounds. Why? 400 calorie deficit. So I definitely think it's hard for me to give you an exact reason without getting more information and looking into things a bit more. But chances are it's mostly a water weight thing, or just a normal like scale fluctuation. Again, you're not going to gain like 5.5 pounds of fat from dropping calories. That's a whole nother rant that I could go on here, where it's, oh, you're low calorie, now your body's just all of a sudden going to go into like fat saving mode and you're going to gain a bunch of fat. Again, that does not happen. That's a myth there. Why could you potentially be up 5.5 pounds? One, what are your methods of weighing in? If it's just one weigh in, the previous 2 weeks, if you're just weighing in once a week, the previous two weigh-ins could have been a little bit lower than what they typically were. And this one, maybe it just is a little bit higher. So I think the first thing would be, hey, make sure I personally, and again, some people don't like to do this because it can mess with their mindset or their mental side of things, but I think taking at least 3 weigh-ins per week is going to be the best way here to really get a good idea of what's going on from a water weight standpoint. If you just take one, again, you're at the risk of some of these things being off from the previous day. The first thing is like, what does that look like? That would be the first thing I would ask. But from there, okay, again, this is counterintuitive. You were in a surplus, slight surplus. Now you're dropping down calories. You should be just dropping weight, right? And again, I see that this doesn't always happen. There's two clients that I can think of off the top of my head in their last fat loss phase where they started out like they were in a deficit and their weight just really wasn't moving very much. But like both of them, I could see in their videos for their form videos, you are looking leaner. And I'm like, look, you're just hanging on to some water for whatever reason. And I'll talk about what could be going on there. And then sure enough, a couple of weeks in, boom, they had that whoosh effect and everything was trending down and they were leaner. So really the point I'm trying to make there is don't get like, we want to look at the scale, but that can't be everything, right? If you're visually looking leaner, it's like, you got to take that as a win, right? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. Would you rather look worse, but be lower, but have a lower scale weight? Or would you rather look better and your scale weight be a little bit higher? I know which one I'm choosing. Ultimately, that's up to you there. So what are some things that could be going on? Did you have saltier foods the day before or over the last week, right? Did you add in some salt there? Are you under a bit more stress? Has a huge role in your water weight. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it where someone's stress has been super high, and whether we give them a higher calorie day to drop stress, or they just drop stress on their own from whatever's going on, and then boom, they have that big whoosh effect. So stress is a big thing as well too. Like I said, did you weigh in under different conditions? Did you eat more food volume so you have more food in your stomach? Again, this is a common thing. Is hey, you're outside of a fat loss phase, you're eating maybe lower food volume foods, and then all of a sudden you increase your food volume and you just have more food in your stomach and just more volume of food, and boom, that could be causing you to see an increase in scale weight. Did you not go to the bathroom the day before? Again, that's going to be a big one as well too. If you are backed up and you're eating less calories, now things aren't moving through as quickly anymore. Well, again, that could be something that is going on there. And then lastly, for women, your menstrual cycle, that's going to have a huge impact on your water weight as well too. And within all of this, some people they retain more water, some people retain less water, and it's just individual here in terms of what happens. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what may be going on. And if you're somebody who's doing this, if you see it go up, that's what's going on there. if I miss taking my creatine one day, should I double up the next day? So I would be more focused on figuring out how to take it daily versus doubling up. If you just miss once or once in a while, I wouldn't worry about it. You could do extra the next day, but it likely wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things, so long as this isn't happening regularly. Because again, either way, if it's happening regularly, yes, it is going to start to add up. But our problem isn't, hey, should you double up the next day? It's, hey, you should probably just stay consistent with it. What I will say with creatine, sometimes higher doses can cause some GI distress. So that would be the only potential issue with that. But again, I think the big thing here is, all right, let's figure out why you're not taking this daily and then make sure that happens. But again, if it happens every once in a while and you've done double what you typically do and you don't notice any GI distress, I think from time to time, that's a solid strategy there. I think at the end of the day, if you were to do every other day and say your dose is 5 grams and instead you take 10 grams every other day, I would imagine that you probably wouldn't see any downside to that over the long run. I don't know if they've done any studies on this. That would actually be super interesting. But my thought would be, in terms of how creatine works, that you wouldn't necessarily see any downside to that. The only downside would potentially be the GI distress that I mentioned there. So that could happen. I personally, though, would, if you were a client, we would be making sure that you're taking it daily. The person asking this actually is a client, but for you, the listener who's not a client, our goal would be to make sure that we're focused on figuring out how to take it daily. Again, is that stacking it on top of a habit you're already doing? Whatever that is, that would be our main goal. But real quick, I just want to go over a few creatine thoughts here and there. First, it's something that we always want to take. If you don't need to cycle off of it, so you can take it at all times. Benefits, you're obviously going to get the strength and muscular benefits from it, but there's also some recovery benefits, brain health benefits potentially as well too. And so again, it's very well researched. It's not necessarily expensive, and it's well researched, and it has those benefits. So to me, this is like a low risk, high reward, low risk, medium reward, really no downside to taking it, right? So it's, hey, if you can spend 30 to 50 bucks every couple months, I would do it. Who can benefit from it the most? I think anyone who is strength focused and hypertrophy focused, I think you should take it. But people who could benefit probably a little bit more would be older people. Again, the older is relative, but it's just, as you age, it's probably more important to take creatine. And then lastly, vegans, and maybe even women too. I would say women probably are also, very important for them to take creatine. And then again, people who eat a more plant-based diet, because again, creatine is found in like meats and stuff like that. Again, those would be the people who would really see the most benefit from it. It's pretty cool too. There's also some research that it can help improve cognitive function during like periods of like low sleep and like high stress as well too. Again, taking it during that period of time can be super helpful. Yeah, that's my just ramble on creatine. That's it for today's episode. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions on this, you can always reach out on Instagram. More than happy to answer it. If you have any questions on any of the stuff today and how to figure it out, again, that's what my free 30-minute strategy call is for. If you're interested in that, the link to that is in the show notes, and I'll chat with you guys next time.